Well, good afternoon. Thank you. It is wonderful to see all of you. We have a capacity crowd today in a sold-out event, so thank you for joining us and sharing your time. We'd like to thank everyone who is streaming live online, and for those who are listening via podcast or viewing via YouTube, we're delighted to have you with us. It is a tremendous honor to have Ralph Cossa back. Some of you were with us in the room in February when Ralph participated with our good friends Scott Snyder and Victor Cha on a political forecast for the year. And we asked Ralph to come back and give us something of a year in review or a year-end synopsis to help us close out the year. And it has no doubt been an incredibly complex year relative to the Korean Peninsula, to nuclear tests on the part of North Korea and their missile developments and other tests, concern in the international community about that, movement in terms of Japan-Korea relations, and certainly in the trilateral context with the United States, concerns about China and the South and East China Seas, and now concerns about the Philippines and the Philippine-U.S. relationship, given President Duterte's comments. So it is a region that has seen perhaps a level of tension rise and a level of activity that's almost unprecedented in many of our memories. To help guide us through that is, again, one of the leading experts in the United States, Ralph Cossa, who is president of Pacific Forum CSIS, which is the Honolulu-based arm of CSIS. And Ralph is one of the most traveled, if not the most traveled American in the region. He participates in all of the senior dialogues, provides a great deal of senior level advisory and consultation. And when Ralph thinks and writes and speaks, people do listen and note. And his counsel is extremely invaluable and has been to people in government as well as to those who are in the Track 2 community, dialoguing, and to the scholarly community as well. So, Ralph, thank you very much. We're happy to have you here. We're happy to have Luann here as well. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all.
Thanks, Steve. Don't get people's hopes up a little too high here now, okay?
Oh, we're good friends.
No, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be back at Korea Society. For any of you who may have been at the meeting in March, I think I accurately predicted everything that has happened so far. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I'm sure it must have been.
Yeah, I think Nikki figured 97.8%.
Good. We'll settle for that. But it's certainly been I think, a very interesting year in Asia. I think some of the things were predictable. Other things, of course, I think we were worried back in March about the Philippine election and what a populist president in the Philippines, what direction he would take things in, but nobody predicted that he would come out as virulently anti-American as he has. We had a little discussion this morning, and one of the points that I made is that I don't think it's good to take a snapshot of the picture today and assume that this is the way it's going to be. I think we're in sort of a transitional phase right now in the Philippines. There are two things that are very popular. One is the president and his anti-drug crusade. The other thing is the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And I think there's a great deal of residual goodwill and support among the people in the Philippines, as well as among the bureaucrats and the elite for the alliance. It's also true that while President Duterte may be the most popular serving politician in the country, he's not the most popular politician in the country. That's former President Ramos. And President Ramos came out very strongly yesterday, essentially resigning from his advisory capacity and accusing the president of putting the security of the Philippine nation at risk by insulting his allies. So I think that this hopefully will have sort of a tempering effect, and we'll see things sort of right the ship. We can remember when the DPJ first came into power in Japan. Everyone was talking about the end of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And when Roh Moo-hyun became president of South Korea, we were all talking about how they were going to tilt toward North Korea and things were going to fall apart. But Churchill once made the comment about Americans normally do the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities. I think most countries do the right thing. We're still in the process of exhausting all the possibilities, but hopefully we'll do the right thing here coming up shortly. And we have some self-correcting mechanisms, and I think there are some in other democratic societies as well. So I'm concerned, but I'm not overly worried right now about the Philippines. We were talking earlier this morning about the different hotspots, about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula, and I think there's enough to be concerned about in all of those areas, but I also see things as being perhaps less threatening than many people would see. Steve, I don't know if you want me to go on all of that, or whether we
Sure.
want to.
Why don't you guide us through the region? Thinking back to those original comments, and then sort of wrapping on where you think we are pre-election.
Yeah, I think one of the success stories in the region, and I think the U.S. takes partial credit for it at least, has been the transformation in Myanmar or Burma. And that's an area where my organization, the Pacific Forum, spends a lot of time. We've been conducting seminars and workshops to try to train the bureaucrats in Myanmar on essentially how to come into compliance with the various international protocols that they've already signed, and to also sort of help develop the role, try to open up some doors with the Tatmadaw, with the military there, and create a dialogue. So I think if we can start with the good news, I think that's certainly been the good news. The focus, of course, has been very much on the South China Sea, and that's an area that's been of growing concern. I will be, if I can be quite blunt, to follow up on what I said in March. I think the Chinese, there was a debate in China a couple of years ago, and the debate was between those who believed that China was permanently rising and the United States was permanently declining, and time was on China's side and the natural order of things was going to sort of evolve. And those who felt that maybe it's a little too premature to count the United States out, that the U.S. may be having a couple of bad years and may be a little preoccupied and may have a president that's sort of overthinking things, and China may have some leverage because of North Korea and others that they can exploit. And as a result, China needed to sort of create some new facts on the ground and sort of take advantage of this momentary distraction. And I think the latter group won out. And I think what we saw in the last couple of years in the South China Sea has been sort of the Chinese exploiting this, trying to create new facts on the ground, and they've done that very well in some respects. We were talking during the lunch about the significance of these Chinese bases in the South China Sea. I will tell you, as someone who spent a career in the U.S. military before being able to think for a living, as I do now, those bases would be, in our vernacular, called a target-rich environment. From a strategic standpoint, they're extremely vulnerable and really don't provide much military advantage. From a psychological standpoint, and during peacetime, of course, they are very significant and help to increase the Chinese military shadow. I've said when you look at the PLA, they're certainly a growing force, a significant military force, but beware of the Wizard of Oz effect. If you recall the story of the Wizard of Oz, the big, powerful, all-seeing wizard, and then someone looked behind the screen and found out it was this little short guy casting this great big shadow. And I think the Chinese, both economically and militarily and politically for that matter, are still pretty small, casting a very big shadow. They certainly look a lot bigger if you're sitting in Manila than if you're sitting in Washington. But in reality, at the end of the day, no one that I'm aware of in Asia wakes up in the morning saying, gee, I wish my government treated us more like the Chinese government treats its people, and whether our political system was more like the Chinese political system. China still, and I don't think anyone in the United States would want to swap our problems for China's problems going forward, because I think they've got some significant ones, given the deep-rooted corruption and sort of the economic problems that lie ahead. So it's important to focus on the South China Sea. The Chinese are looking to sort of exploit the advantage where they can. I think the good news in the past several months, again, something I think that was pretty well predicted by everyone, is that the Hague Tribunal ruling would very much be against China's interest. We were quite frankly surprised by just how against China's interests and how specific it was in many respects. Where we go from here, because of the big unknown of President Duterte and what he's trying to do and not trying to do, is still up in the air. But I think we're sort of looking at that and need to see how this plays out. If I was a U.S. government official, I would be praising the Philippines for getting China to de facto accept the Hague Tribunal. In fact, the Chinese probably haven't done that, but it would sort of force the Chinese either to move in one direction or the other, and that would be, I think, a win-win for us. The Chinese made a lot of promises to the Philippine president during his visit there. Anyone who's watched Chinese deals in the past know about half of that will not transpire, and the other half will be China sending 600 workers into Manila to build a new building, and then the building will get built and 400 of the workers will stay, start opening up business, trying to marry Filipino women, since it's 127 men to every 100 women in China, and that's still a problem. And at some point, the Philippines will be worrying about the same kind of question that I've heard in other countries. I was in Timor a number of years ago, and the first question I got in the public discussion was, how do we continue to get Chinese money without getting all these damn Chinese? And that's, I think, always been a challenge, and I think our Philippine colleagues will start dealing with that in the long run. In the meantime, the good news is I think things have quieted down in the South China Sea. I think the Chinese are smart enough to not want to become an election issue in the United States any more than they are, and haven't given either of the candidates a reason to paint themselves in a corner in dealing with China. So right now things are kind of quiet. There's less need for the U.S. to conduct freedom of navigation operations, since the UN tribunal essentially clarified what's legal and what's not legal in that area, and disputed all of the Chinese claims. So that's allowed, I think, tensions to become reduced. I think in the East China Sea also, we're sort of a respite. The Chinese still sort of irritate the Japanese where they can. But I had an interesting conversation with a Chinese admiral once who said, you don't have to worry about us getting into a shooting war with the Japanese Navy, primarily because we know we'd lose. And in fact, that is the reality. The Japanese Navy is far superior to the Chinese Navy, and the Chinese know it and the Japanese know it, so they'll sort of play chicken with one another in that area. The real concern, as it's always been, is an accident and not being able to manage the accident. And that's why it's good news that there's at least been some talks about hotlines and more dialogue between China and Japan so that they can manage the accident. In the meantime, again, being perhaps politically incorrect, I think both President Xi and Prime Minister Abe see the benefit of having a little bit of tension in the relationship, because it drums up nationalism on both sides. So there's not a great deal of incentive to completely solve the problem as long as it's serving their domestic political purposes. The Chinese don't want that to get out of hand, however, and the main reason is an economic reason. There are 10 million Chinese working in Japanese-owned factories in China. If you get a little too far-fetched and too energetic in your anti-Japan programs, and the Japanese say, okay, we'll take our plants and move them to Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia, which is already happening, but it would happen on an accelerated rate. This could have a significant economic impact. So the Chinese occasionally will accuse the U.S. and Japan and others of having a containment policy against China. The reality is nothing could be further from the truth. The U.S. made the decision, and so did Japan and Europe and others a number of years ago, that China was going to rise. It could either rise in a hostile manner, or it could rise in a manner where it was economically and politically interdependent with the West. And as a result, that resulted in billions of dollars of direct foreign investment from Japan, from Korea, from Europe, and from the United States in the Chinese economic miracle to create that kind of economic interdependence. And that makes it very costly on either side to have a significant confrontation and sort of put some boundaries on the competition that we have. We will still not get along with China in a large number of areas. Certainly we have different political systems that don't complement one another. But at the end of the day, we've sort of created this economic interdependence. You hear people say, I talk about the Thucydides trap, if you will, the rising power and the established power, and conflict is inevitable. Well, all we have to do is look at the history of the 20th century. Germany rose 3 times during the 20th century. The first 2 times, the effort was to hold them back, kick them while they're down, very unhappy endings. But let's not forget, Germany rose a 3rd time during the 20th century. That time, through the Marshall Plan, through the interaction with the United States and others. And whereas 100 years ago, people were worried about Germany taking over Europe, now they're hoping it will do it. And they see Germany as part of the saving grace as part of an integrated Europe. Japan rose twice during the 20th century. The first time, not so happy. Memorial of that, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor here next month in Hawaii. But Japan rose a 2nd time to become the world's 2nd largest economy and still the 3rd largest economy in the world. But this time interconnected with the United States. I think that's the same philosophy that we've had toward China. And I think at the end of the day, it's working and will continue to work. So I think we'll continue to have stress and conflict, but at the end of the day, we're going to manage that because it's in our national interest and the Chinese national interest to do that. The real wild card in all of this, and if I had the solutions, I'd put myself in for a Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, I don't, and that's how do we deal with North Korea? And that's an intractable problem. I've said before, I'm sure I said this back in March, but the couple of things that you need to know in thinking about North Korea. Number one, they're not crazy. The leader of North Korea is not irrational. When you say someone is irrational, what you're saying is, I don't understand their rationale. My basic belief is that no one does something that he or she thinks is irrational. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why does the leader of North Korea, why does the leader of the United States or China or anyone else think what they're doing is rational? And the reason the North Koreans think what they're doing is rational is because it works. This has been a closed hermit society that has managed to survive for years, first by playing China against the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union went away. They started playing China against the United States. They play South Korea against itself, the conservatives versus the progressives, and they've managed to play this game. Their strategy, if you will, is stop or I'll shoot. And no one knows how to deal with that. You want to say take your best shot, but on the other hand, the splatter effect could be terrible. Seoul is within artillery range of North Korea. It's not North Korea's nuclear weapons that stop the United States and Seoul from marching north. It's the devastation that they could wreak on South Korea and on 25 million people living in and around Seoul before you finally remove them from the face of the earth. So we have to find ways to deal with that. I'm working on a study right now on what are the options for the next administration. The Korean Peninsula is known as the land of lousy options. And I wish I could tell you that here's a option B that's, is a good one. So what we're searching for is the least worst option. And there's a range. On the one hand, you can do everything the North Koreans ask. You can recognize them as a nuclear weapon state, establish diplomatic relations, and then try to go from there. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, you can decide, all right, enough is enough. Tell U.S. forces, Korea, march on Pyongyang. Let's get rid of these guys once and for all. That's not going to happen either. So those are the extremes. But in between that, I think there are a number of options. Trying the Leap Day Agreement again, where we essentially freeze in return for humanitarian assistance. That seemed like a good idea in 2012 until 16 days later, the North Koreans launched a missile. So it was a good idea for 16 days. Doesn't mean we shouldn't revisit that with the next administration. And there are a number of things, starting the six-party talks, starting different bilateral talks. I think at the stage we're at today, we also need to put on the table a discussion of peaceful or regime change by peaceful means or by non-military means, where we make the decision that we want to deal with North Korea, but we can't deal with this particular regime. And you have to pursue a policy that assures the Chinese and the Russians that you will allow a North Korean state to continue to exist, but that it cannot be led by North Korea, and you play to the fissures that everyone sees are already there within the North Korean society. That's a risky option. I don't know that it's the least worst option, but for many years now, the word regime change has been a forbidden word. We can't put that on the table because regime change means marching on Pyongyang. But we need to get the North Koreans' attention and talking about they already are convinced, or they say they're convinced, that we're trying to overthrow their regime. Let's show them what a policy to do that would look like and see if that will finally force them to make a choice. Decisions at the end of the day, if you believe as I do that they're rational actors, are the costs associated with nuclear weapons, having nuclear weapons, greater than the benefits? It's a simple cost-benefit analysis. The North Koreans say right now their policy is to have nuclear weapons and economic development. The U.S. policy is to convince them that they can't. It's as Deputy Secretary of State Blinken said in Seoul or Beijing a couple of days ago, our policy is not to bring them to their knees, it's to bring them to their senses. Well, quite frankly, the only way you're going to bring them to their senses is for them to be convinced that the alternative is you're going to bring them to their knees. So I think that's an option that has to be pursued as well. Is it the best of the least worst of the options? I don't know, but we need to at least be talking about this as we look to the new administration. And the other point that I would make, just to undermine everything that I've just said, at the end of the day, U.S. policy toward North Korea will be driven more by the results of the election in 2017 in Korea than they will be by the results of the election here next week in the United States. Because U.S. policy has always, in effect, had to be in sync with the policy in South Korea. It's their country, it's their peninsula, it's their lives at stake. So once we get through our silly season here, we may be trying to then make sure that our policies are in sync with the PAC administration for as long as it remains. But at the best case, they'll be gone in a year. At the worst case, who knows right now? And then whoever comes to power in South Korea will have, if not a veto on U.S. policy, will certainly have a strong influence on the direction that we ultimately go with North Korea. So that's,
Thank you,
I just told you everything I know.
That's great.
But happy to answer questions.
So I have 3 questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the table. The first is about China-Korea. And that is, you said a lot about China in your overview relative to South China Sea, but we do have a party Congress coming up. There'll be some shifts and some consolidation on the Standing Committee and the Politburo. So I guess the question is about that consolidation relative to Korea, North and South. And then the add-on to that is the TAD debate, which has been something that has developed in interesting ways this year. Yeah. And some of us feel that TAD is much more of a political debate than a security debate. And what might that entail?
All right. Well, China, Korea. First of all, there were Americans that were worrying a year or two ago that South Korea was tilting toward China. That was absolute nonsense. But President Park was trying to play a China card, if you will, vis-a-vis North Korea. I think she found out that she had a king, but the North Koreans still had the ace. At the end of the day, she didn't get what she wanted when the nuclear test and et cetera occurred. I think the South Koreans were expecting China to be more on the South side, quote unquote, and that didn't happen. And I think she lost some credibility in that area. And certainly my sense in talking to people in South Korea now is there's a great deal of disillusionment about China's ability and willingness to play a positive role on the Korean Peninsula. And I think this is almost a bipartisan view in China. In Korea. I'm not sure progressives have any greater trust in the Chinese than the conservatives do. So I think that relationship has become a bit strained. Everyone is sort of watching what's happening in the party Congress. I will say that 2 years ago I made a prediction, which I'm going to continue to stick by, and that's that Xi Jinping will break with tradition and will not essentially name his successor at the next party Congress and serve his second 5-year term and then quietly go off into the horizon like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin did. I think he is setting himself up to be the new Mao, if you will, to be the leader, and quite frankly is afraid to turn it over in 6 years to someone else because he has alienated so many factions and broken so many rice bowls that he wouldn't trust anyone but himself to stay in power, or he might be finding himself in the same situation that he's put others in. So I would say watch this space for the party Congress this year. I'd be very surprised if he in fact names and puts a successor into place. I think he will sort of stack the deck with his supporters, but he will sort of lay the groundwork for him staying on. I don't think there's anything legislatively that prevents him, certainly from staying on as the party chairman, even if he gave up the presidency. But I'd be surprised if he even did that. In the meantime, we have the THAAD issue. That's the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System that South Korea has agreed with the U.S. that we should deploy these systems on the Korean Peninsula to defend against North Korean ballistic missiles. This system has limited value against a low altitude, a Scud or something like that, but it is also effective in preventing a North Korean missile that is being shot at Japan or at Guam or at my home in Hawaii, so I think it's a good idea. I'm not particularly happy about being vulnerable to North Koreans. I don't think they're suicidal, but on the other hand, they can reach me and they can't reach you. So it's theoretical to you. It's probably more personal on my side. We have a strategic nuclear dialogue with the Chinese. The Pacific Forum does. Our last meeting in June, we brought in THAAD experts who gave technical briefings and showed all the capabilities and showed what it could and couldn't do vis-a-vis China. The Chinese came away from those briefings better informed, but not convinced. And the reason they're not convinced is because THAAD is not a military issue in China. It's a political issue. THAAD is an issue of whether or not the South Koreans will tilt toward China, whether or not they can play the game. And even though they know the decision has been made and THAAD is coming, it's still an opportunity by expressing concern to create divisions within the internal body politic in South Korea. Some would call that interfering in Korea's internal affairs, but of course the Chinese would never do that because they don't believe in interfering in other countries' internal affairs. But clearly, I think that's the game that's being played with right now with THAAD. I would just a brief word about China-North Korea relations. I don't know what's going on there right now. Chinese that I have talked to have said we're prepared to push North Korea to the brink of economic collapse in order to get them to give up their nuclear program. And while I was having that conversation back in June with the Chinese at a fairly senior level, the number 3 person in the North Korean Politburo shows up in China and gets a meeting with Xi Jinping. And I asked my Chinese colleagues, could you explain that? And the answer was no. We have no idea why they met. We would have, if we were betting, we would have bet they wouldn't have met, that she would not have met with them. So it reinforces the view that I get whenever I talk with the North Koreans, and that's that China needs us more than we need China. And I think the North Koreans believe that there is nothing they can do that will cause the Chinese to pull the life support plug. And so far, everything China has done has reinforced that thinking in the North Korean mind. So I think that's been the real challenge. China has leverage over North Korea that it has chosen not to use. You hear the traditional reason being either, well, we don't want North Korean refugees flooding into China, or we need to have a buffer zone. Well, a buffer zone might have made sense during the 19th century. It might have even made sense during the 20th century. But today, a buffer zone in the world of internet and public media and social media and everything else is sort of Cold War thinking or 20th century thinking. And the fact remains, there are more people born in China every year than live in North Korea. China is 1.3 billion. North Korea is like 22 million, somewhere like that. You could take the entire population of North Korea, put 2 of them in each village in China, you wouldn't even know they were there. So yes, a massive exodus from North Korea would create headaches and nightmares for the Chinese for a couple of months. But these North Koreans aren't fleeing to China because they want to spend the rest of their life in China. They want to do just as the East Germans did, which was get from East Germany through somewhere else to West Germany in order to get back to East Germany, a free East Germany. And that's sort of the bottom line. So the good news in that regard is that 5 years ago when I went to China, I would sit and have very heated debates with my Chinese colleagues about how foolish I thought their China policy or their North Korea policy was. Now when I go to China, I sit back and listen to the Chinese debate one another on how foolish their policy is toward North Korea. I think they are reevaluating. At some point, the North Koreans are going to be insulting enough and egregious enough and counterproductive enough that the Chinese will finally get serious and start honoring the sanctions and help support forcing the North Koreans to make that choice between nuclear weapons and economic development. To date, that hasn't occurred. And as long as the North Koreans don't have to make the choice, they won't. That's the rational thing to do.
Let me ask you then one more question before turning to the audience, and that is that you spend a lot of time pursuing Track 2 or unofficial activities and communications, some of which involve the North Koreans directly. And so my question is, where do you think they are in terms of their ability to communicate approaches to us? Are we listening in the right way? Are they feeling hunkered down? Are they in need of safety valves to express themselves relative to what's happened with sanctions? And what do you think ultimately do they want?
Respect, survival. I think if you get 10 so-called North Korea experts in a room together, they'll give you 12 different opinions on just about everything, except what's the North Koreans' number one objective. And every one of us will say survival. And I think that's very clear. I think 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the North Koreans' number one objective was unification of the Korean Peninsula under the North. I don't think they believe that that's going to happen or could happen. Just the sheer numbers, and look at the GDP and the economic development between the two, but the numbers. There's 40 million South Koreans, 20 million North Koreans. So right now, I think the North Koreans' primary objective is survival, to survive as a North Korean state. And of course, the Kim regime's number one survival is the survival of the Kim regime in charge of the North Korean state. So anything else that they do has got to have that in mind. They don't like the fact that they are increasingly dependent on China and would certainly welcome the opportunity to have better relations with the United States. But they're, I don't think, prepared to give up what we expect them to give up in order to have that. So we're still in the sort of negotiating process there. I think General Clapper, the director of national intelligence, made the comment, inappropriate comment, I might add, that it was a lost cause to try to get the North Koreans to give up nuclear weapons. He's probably right, but the role of the national intelligence officer is to say the North Koreans are bound and determined to keep their nuclear weapons. The role then of the political community and the operators is to say, okay, that means maybe our current policy is a lost cause. When the intel community starts commenting on policy, they've overstepped their bounds, because then you run into fear, well, if the intel community is recommending policy, then they may be cooking the intelligence to support that policy. It's been a time-honored, I spent a number of years in the intel community early in my military career, and the first thing they do is sit you in a room and say, do not utter a word about policy. That's somebody else's job. You want to just stick with the facts. So he spoke the truth in many respects, but he shouldn't have been saying it. Someone else, I think, should have been saying it. But that's, I think, the reality we have to deal with. To me, decisions come down in the simplest form to a cost-benefit analysis. If the costs of keeping nuclear weapons exceed the benefits of keeping them, and if the benefits of giving them up exceed the benefits or the costs of keeping them, then you make a decision in that regard. So far for the North Koreans, the costs involved in remaining a nuclear power haven't exceeded the benefits that they see in keeping their nuclear weapons. And we alone will have a difficult time creating sufficient costs without China and Russia and others participating in that effort.
I did want to thank Ralph for being part of the 60th anniversary series at the Korea Society. Beginning in January, we will be making a lot of announcements about the Korea Society at 60 years since its founding. 2017 is our anniversary year, and we kicked off our 60th anniversary policy season just this fall. There are a few things coming up that I wanted to alert you to. December 1st is the counterpart session to this on economic finance and trade, a look back at the year, and President Tom Byrne will be moderating that. December 6th, Tom, along with Ambassador Kathy Stevens and General Walter Sharp, will be out at Stanford University for a noon session at Stanford's Encina Hall, if you know anyone in the Bay Area who would be interested. And back on December 12th, here, we have a report released by Ambassador Robert Gallucci and Dr. Victor Cha on recommendations for the new president. So don't miss that the morning of December 12th. We'd also like to recommend to you a very valuable source or a couple of sources which are available through Ralph's organization. One is Comparative Connections, which is the preeminent triannual that deals with the relationships across the Asia Pacific. It is available free of charge if you Google Pacific Forum, Comparative Connections, and I believe it's comparativeconnections.com, right? Is that right? And then PACnet is a very valuable service to sign up for, where you get briefs from individuals across the region on pertinent issues of the day and a lot of what's happening in Asia, so don't miss that. Nikita Desai, thank you for your work, and she has asked me to remind you to please complete your evaluations. And really, I wanted to thank Ralph in a special way. He travels the globe. I'm sure he has a great collection of finely crafted coffee mugs and paperweights from different organizations, but we know that Ralph loves the Yankees. Those of you who have seen him here before know that we try to do things in a different way and recognize that. And so he is an ever-expanding Yankee collection, I hope, in Hawaii, as their local representative, by the way. And so what we wanted to gift him with today is something I think is sort of unique and special, coming off last night's Cubs win as well. And these are two vintage mitts. One is Mickey Mantle, Ralph's hero growing up here in the Bronx. And this is an MM4, which is extremely hard to find. MM6, Mickey Mantle 6, Mickey Mantle 8 are later mitts that are more common, but the MM4 came out in 1956, so 60 years ago, and that was the Triple Crown year for Mickey Mantle. And also, last year we lost Yogi Berra, and there is a Yogi Berra mitt in here as well, both vintage mitts. So we hope they make it to your shelf. Luann, please allow them to put it up at home. If you don't like them, the office might suffice. But enjoy, and thank you, Ralph, and thank you for coming. Thank you to Ralph and Luann, and thank you all, and thank you to Peter Stemke in our sound booth, to Nikki, and to our interns. And I also wanted to recognize two of our very generous donors here at the table before we close. One is Phil here, who has underwritten a new program we'll be announcing, which is a Korea Emerging Scholar lecture series. Thanks to Phil and his wife, the Shermans have been very generous in standing that up in an interest in growing recognition of new talent and thought leaders on Korea. And I wanted to thank Julia Quincy, who is the largest single continuous patron ticket purchaser at our galas, and she's been very generous over half a dozen years. And Julia, we appreciate your kindness and support. She's also a Kim Koo Fellow here, part of our professional series. Thank you for all your time. Please do visit with Ralph as his time permits, and see us at koreasociety.org for our programs and for membership. We'd love to have you as a member. And again, you can hand your forms to Nikki or to one of our interns. Thank you so much for coming.